Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most beneficent, the infinitely merciful. It is a pleasure to be with all of you here this evening. Before I begin, I would like to commend the TMA Scarborough, UFT Scarborough campus group for organizing this event, and the young men and women who presented before me, the brother who recited Quran, the two sisters who recited poetry. Excellent really, and very relevant to inshallah what I will be talking of this evening. So I'd like to begin by thanking the TMA for inviting me to speak this evening, and the subject, as you've all heard, is lessons from Ashura, overcoming the barrier me. The barrier me refers to our egoic self that prevents us from living a life that is true and real to ourselves. It is our egoic selves that causes us to wear a mask every time we leave our homes, every time we step out of our homes and we begin interacting with others. And it is what makes us live a life that is filled with illusions and pretensions. It is what makes us live a life that is filled with concern about what others think and have to say about us, or at least what we perceive others think and say about us. And we do this for such a long time, from the time we are born really, that after a while it becomes difficult to tell the difference between the real me and the illusory me that is the barrier to the real me. So tonight, inshallah, we wish to look closely at Ashura and see what we can learn from this tragic yet momentous event in human history that may perhaps help us to overcome the barrier of the false me. In other words, can we draw from Ashura the guidelines and even the inspiration to challenge ourselves and gather the strength to disassociate from our false identity, whether it is related to our culture, whether it is related to habits we've formed, addictions, or just personal preferences that together make up a person that is not only the real me, but even keeps me away from the real me and keeps the real me in constant slumber or a state of unconsciousness. Now, if time would permit, we would dwell first on this idea of the egoic self and the false me and what that is all about. But I'm making an assumption here, but I also have this conviction that many of you already are aware of this, that what we're trying to break through here. We know that the tragedy of Karbala on the day of Ashura 61 AH can help us fight and overcome our egoic selves, because when we think of Imam Hussain, peace be on him, and his companions, what we see happening on the day of Ashura is a mass awakening to reality. Something significant was going on in the camp of Imam Hussain, and in particular on the day of Ashura. And if we can nail this, if we can understand what is it that was actually going on that day, we may be able to break down barriers and tear down veils that separate us from our true selves. And we may also gain the courage to push ourselves towards spiritual progress, towards the righteous path, and towards a habit of always making the right choices in life, even if they are the most difficult and the most unpleasant choices we have to make. But before I begin to share my thoughts on what was happening on Ashura and some of the lessons that we can take from there and use them as guidelines for our own struggles in life, I want to just make a small note of caution. I mentioned just a few moments ago that a lot of times the wrong habits that we form in life, the egoic selves that we identify with, are tied to our culture, our habits, our backgrounds, how we were raised, family, race, community, and so on. And this might give us the false impression that the way to find the right path is to oppose anything that has to do with culture but not Islam. It is important to understand that Islam is not opposed to culture. At least it is not opposed to culture just for the sake of culture. The Prophet Muhammad, blessings and peace be on him and his family, for example, was an Arab by birth, by ethnicity. And when we study the life of the Prophet, what we find is that besides his being a prophet and bringing change in his society, the manner in which he lived, a lot of what he did, whether it was how he ate or how he slept or how he rode on an animal or how he behaved with others or how he dressed, was in line with the Arab culture. So it wasn't just about eliminating culture and replacing it with something else. Islam has its culture, but there is also a broader definition of culture outside religion, and Islam has not come to replace that. Young people tend to be idealists, and they sometimes have this mistaken belief that their duty is to oppose anything in the community that is cultural but not Islamic. Anything that they can't find proof for in Islam must be abolished and removed. So they tend to criticize everything that is cultural but not Islamic in their perspective. And if you study this carefully, this actually is exactly the thinking we find in radical elements in Islam. If you study, the Salafi, who are more well known by some as Wahhabism or Takfirism and so on and so forth, you see there is this idea of everything is bid'ah unless proven otherwise. We on the other hand speak of being cultured in the sense of having a civilized etiquette and customs that are noble. And as long as our habits, identity, culture do not impede us from growing spiritually and do not border on what is forbidden in Islam or haram, we don't have to oppose it. We can even learn to see the beauty in the differences in our cultures. Like, for example, how we commemorate the tragedy of Karbala and the events of Muharram and the mourning for Imam Hussain and his companions. Our problem as a Muslim community, and in particular as Shia's community in Toronto at least, is that we unfortunately allow our cultures to insulate ourselves and separate us from each other. And that can lead to at least hints of racism, bigotry, and things like that. But in and of itself, culture is not wrong, nor is it a bad thing. So we're trying essentially to break down who we are in order to discover our true identity. Sorry, I apologize. We are not trying to break down who we are in order to discover our identity. What we're trying to do is to shave off those false layers of me that have grown into our personalities through emotional conflict, fears, insecurities, and so on from our birth onwards. As an example would be the fear of what others think about us, as opposed to what God the Almighty thinks about us. And we're trying to learn from Ashura how to go about doing this. That the real obstacle is not being able to wake up and disidentify from this false self, or disidentify completely with the body. It is this complete identification with the body and with the egoic self that is actually the root of this imaginary fear as well, where we constantly worry what others think about me, right? And I'll give you more examples. So let's just get right into it. And what I will do, inshallah, is I will share 7 different lessons that we can see very easily from Karbala and Ashura. And I'll try and give you an example from Karbala, but I will also try and relate it to the egoic self and how this can be a means to break that barrier. The first lesson is we must learn to ignore negative peer pressure. And this is very relevant for many of us here who are university students, because there is tremendous peer pressure once you leave home and when you're living on campus. I don't need to actually sell this to you. I think you know what I'm talking about. When we look at Karbala, for example, we see numerous examples of peer pressure or just pressure, social pressure from others to change who we are or what we should do. As an example, we have Hurr bin Yazid al-Riyahi was a commander-in-chief, and he was responsible initially for having brought Imam Hussain, for having stopped him from entering Kufa and brought him to Karbala. But he repented on the morning of Ashura and came over to Imam Hussein's side. Now, it's very easy to talk about this, but if you were to place yourself in his shoes, there was tremendous pressure on him not to do so. Because he wasn't just a soldier. He was a commander of an entire unit in the army. And you hear this in Muharram as well, that even while Hurr was undecided, and whilst he was standing between the army he came with and the camp of Imam al-Hussein, and whilst he's saying to himself, I find myself standing between hell and heaven, making a choice between hellfire and paradise. You still see people trying to convince him not to go. Like the man who came to him and said, Hurr, why do I see you trembling? If anyone was to ask me who was the most courageous man in Kufa, I would have mentioned your name. Now that's a huge boost to one's ego, isn't it? If you're trembling, you're undecided, should I not, and somebody pulls you with words like this, it's very easy to say, you know what, I'm being irrational here, right? But he doesn't give in to peer pressure. You take the example of Imam Hussain himself, peace be on him. If you actually read the events leading up to Ashura, you will find that when Imam Hussain arrived in Karbala, it was the 2nd of Muharram, and the battle took place on the 10th of Muharram. Until Shimr al-Jawshan arrived on the 9th of Muharram, the leader of the forces of Yazid was Umar ibn Sa'ad. He was having nightly meetings with Imam al-Hussein on a daily basis. You don't hear this all the time from the pulpit because of the lack of time, and there is a focus more on the mourning and the tragedy. But if you read books that actually do the analysis of what happened, you find that Umar ibn Sa'ad was meeting the Imam on a daily basis, and they would sit until late at night every single day, 2nd Muharram, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and he was constantly trying to convince Imam al-Hussein. Because Umar ibn Sa'ad is a very interesting character to study. He wasn't, in a sense, like Shimr and the others who just wanted to kill Imam Hussein out of hatred for him or his father or the Prophet's family. Umar ibn Sa'ad knew who exactly Imam Hussein was. His problem was the greed for the world. He was promised power, land, authority after. So he found himself in a situation like Hurr's, where on one hand he didn't want to lose what he was going to get. On the other hand, he didn't want to stain his hands with the blood of the Prophet's grandson. And so he was exerting tremendous pressure on Imam Hussain and saying to him, you know what, you don't have to mean it that you're pledging allegiance to Yazid. You could just say it. At least you're saving your family. Now think of that sort of pressure, right? Imagine if you save your life, how much more you can do, how much more you can propagate true Islam. You can let people know who Yazid was at your time, right? This is an opportunity for you to save your life. I mean, let's come up to a deal that works for both of us, right? I get what I want and you don't have to lose your life. There's all this pressure. But Imam Hussain just simply refuses to bend. I'll give my head, but I won't give my hand. Right? So it's another example of peer pressure. There are so many examples. I mean, take the example of Imam Hussein's brother, Al-Abbas, Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas. Right until the time before Ashura, Shimr al-Jawshan brings a letter of amnesty for him and his brothers. He had 3 other brothers with him at Karbala. And he says to him, I've got a letter guaranteeing your safety. You can just walk away from this. Right? So there's all these kind of examples that we can think of. You as well, my dear brothers and sisters, face tremendous peer pressure at university and sometimes even at home, unfortunately. You may have made a conscious decision that you want to live a life that is more spiritual. You want to be faithful to your religion. But you might face tremendous pressure from home as well, you know. What's this religion? What, you know, you're becoming a fanatic, you know. What's all this, you know, now you're growing a beard and now you're praying on time and now, you know, you don't go to the movies and like, you know, what's wrong with you? There's all this, you know, pressure. Sometimes it's emotional blackmail, sometimes it's subliminal within your culture, at workplace, especially if you decide to stand up for something you believe in and something that is important to you. This is where you're sort of struggling. There is the real me that is crying within and saying, wake up, time is running out, the clock is ticking. I'm fed up of duplicity, I'm fed up of being a hypocrite, I'm fed up of being one thing in front of people but being something else behind the scenes. I know this is wrong, I shouldn't be doing this. On the other hand, there's this tremendous pressure from friends, from family, from work, from university to say, you know, this is normal. Don't be weird, don't be this, don't be that, right? Peer pressure. Now, when you stand for the truth, you are great in God's eyes, even if you stand alone. Look at the example of Abraham, peace be on him. The Quran in chapter 16, verse 120, Allah refers to Abraham, he is one man. But God refers to him as an entire nation. He says, Inna Ibrahima kana ummatan qanita, hanifan walam yakum min al-mushrikeen. Indeed, Abraham was a nation unto himself, humble before God, an upright man, and he was not one of the polytheists. Now this is very, very powerful, where a nation is made up of millions of people, but God is describing one man and saying he is a nation unto himself. We take the example of the Battle of Uhud. The Battle of Uhud was fought in the year 3 AH, 3 years after the migration to Medina. It was the only major battle in which the Muslims lost terribly. They were winning that battle, but when they saw the war booty and they started running after that, their greed caused the enemy to turn around, come back, attack them again, and they lost, you know, a lot of prominent members. 70 Muslims were martyred in the battle. And what is interesting, we'll talk about suffering shortly, but what is interesting is that when you look at the Quran, all the battles that the Muslims won, the Quran mentions them in only 1 verse or 2 verses in passing. You know, even the Battle of Badr, it just mentions, and remember when we gave you aid and help and helped you overcome your enemies, or we sent down angels to help you, in passing. But the one battle that they lost, talk about putting salt on wound, the Quran does a very, very detailed post-mortem of it. If you look at Surah Al-Imran, it's 200 verses.
almost the entire second half of the surah is just a post-mortem of that battle. And there's a constant talk about, why you lost the battle and what happened and why. Because as we shall see, we learn the most from suffering and from affliction. Now in this battle, after the battle was over as well, and the Muslims fled up the mountain and they were afraid to come down again, the Prophet, blessings and peace be on him and his family, he sent Imam Ali, peace be on him, with a small group of men to go and find out what was happening. Is the enemy retreating? Are they still waiting for us? What's happening? And when Imam Ali alayhi salam and the other few companions went down, and he was badly injured as well, because he was one of only maybe 2 or 3 who never fled. And despite the injury, despite the weak morale, when he actually went down, they met a man who had just come from the enemy's side. He was a trader, he was just passing by, but he had spoken to the Meccans and he knew what their plans were. Now, he came to them and he said to them, my advice to you is to be very, very, very careful, because these guys are not planning to stop. These guys are just going to finish you off. They've got you where they want you. This is their best chance to kill Muhammad and just end Islam once and for all. Right? So, despite being injured and really, talk about kicking somebody when he's down, that low morale, he was adding fear into their hearts. That you are alone. You're standing alone. You're very, very weak now. This is not a good time for you to show any, any stand. Now, here, Imam Ali and the others respond with something very powerful that the Quran captures and mentions. This is chapter 3 of the Quran, verse 173. الَّذِينَ قَالَ لَهُمُ النَّاسِ إِنَّ النَّاسَ قَدْ جَمَعُوا لَكُمْ فَاخْشَوْهُمْ. Those to whom people say, indeed, others have gathered and amassed against you, therefore fear them. Those to whom people said, all the people have gathered against you, so fear them. What was their reaction? فَزَادَهُمْ إِيمَانًا. Their faith increased. When they were told, beware, people have gathered against you, you would think their faith would shrink. The opposite, they have a surge in faith. فَزَادَهُمْ إِيمَانًا. وَقَالُوا حَسْبُنَا اللَّهُ وَنِعْمَ الْوَكِيلُ. Faith just, exploded in them, and they said, God suffices for us, and He is the best of all trustees. And He is an excellent trustee. Allah is sufficient for us. Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakil. This is the kind of quality we're talking about. This is the kind of lesson 1 that we need to adopt into our lives if we want to break the egoic self. Because the egoic self is afraid of criticism from other than God. The egoic self worries, what are people going to say if I start, praying on campus and someone sees me praying? It's embarrassing, right? What are people going to say if I start wearing hijab? What are people going to say? The egoic self is afraid, because people's opinion is very important, because when people acknowledge me and praise me, my ego inflates. Not only when people laugh at me or jeer at me or make a mockery of me, but even if I think they're looking at me and laughing at me, my ego deflates. But if I can change this completely around and say, what I care about is not peer pressure, what I care about is what does God think? Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakil. I'm already taking one step towards breaking the ego, because I'm not paying attention to what the ego wants. Lesson number 2, preserve your inner purity. Give importance to the hereafter, my dear brothers and sisters. I should be saying my dear sons and daughters. Some of you are young enough to be my children. You need to do that in order to be able to fight addictions. You see, what happens is, we all have addictions. Some addictions might be unlawful, some addictions might be mubah, like coffee, for example, right? And I have spoken about this time and again, that what stops us from breaking our egoic
selves, the shell, the barrier, the veil, whatever you want to call it, is addictions. The more we fight addictions and overcome them, the closer we are to our true self. Now, addictions harm us physically as well as spiritually. There is no addiction that does not harm you. Even if, because addiction is when it becomes a habit that you cannot let go of. When it controls you, you cannot control it. So it could be the internet, for example. If you're addicted to the internet, in and of itself is not a bad thing, but if you're addicted to it, then it is harming you, both physically and spiritually. Right? It could be anything. It could be, as I said, coffee, internet, drugs, food, pornography, good and bad, halal, haram, mubah. Addiction is addiction. What we need to do is, when we want to fight addictions in order to preserve our inner purity, we need to find a spiritual reason, not a physical reason. Let us take an example of something that is not haram. Let us suppose I'm addicted to food. Okay. Now, in and of itself, if the food is halal, overeating is makruh, it is not haram. It is disliked, but it is not punishable and you're going to go to hell because you can't stop eating chicken wings or whatever, right? If you look for a physical reason to fight addiction, if you say, I need to lose weight, you will find your struggle is up and down. There are good days, there are bad days. They say nothing gives you false illusion like the first day of a diet, right? The first day is like, yes, I'm going to lose 20 pounds, right? And you get up early morning, you go jogging, you do all that, right? But because your true nature is spiritual, fighting for physical reasons doesn't give you enough courage, enough fuel to fight that addiction. So at some point, you give up. You say, you know what, I'm just going to live once. Especially when you get to my age, you're thinking like, you know what, I've got a wife now. She's not here, by the way. I've got a wife now, right? For whom am I trying to keep, get six packs and do this and do that? Like, what do I care, right? I live only once. Because my reason is physical. If my reason was spiritual, if I said excessive food is hardening my heart and it is preventing me from tasting the love of my Lord when I get up in the night to worship Him, now I fight my addiction to food with a completely different zeal, because my perspective, my source is different. My reason is spiritual, it is not physical. Okay? If we begin to fast for the pleasure of God, for example, not only is there reward for it, but it also helps the physical, remove the physical harm, but it gives us greater courage. Now, the lesson that I was talking about was preserve your inner purity. That was lesson number 2. Let us take examples from Karbala. Again, I spoke about Hur, and I said Hur was responsible for bringing Imam Hussain to Karbala. He stopped him. He put his hand on the reins of Imam Hussein's horse and said, I will not permit you to enter Kufa. Yet he was saved, and not the others who were just following him. We have another example in Karbala of an eminent companion who was named Zuhair ibn al-Qayn. Zuhair ibn al-Qayn was actually opposed to Imam Hussain. He was so opposed to him that it just so happened that when Imam Hussain left Mecca and was heading towards Kufa, Zuhair was traveling with his family. And he went out of his way to avoid Imam Hussain. Wherever Hussain stopped, he continued moving. Wherever Imam Hussain would start riding, he would stop and camp there. So he's on purpose, he's trying to avoid any contact with Hussain. And then by chance, they stop at one place together, and Imam Hussain sends for Zuhair and says, tell him to come, I want to speak to him. And a messenger comes to him. And again he refuses. He says, I don't want to have anything to do with this. And it's his wife, talk about behind every successful man is a woman. His wife is the one who says, just like the wife of Habib, who tells Habib, you must go to Karbala. It is Zuhair's wife who says to him, have you no shame? The grandson of the Prophet, the son of Zahra, has asked you only for a meeting. He's not telling you to join his army. He's just asking you to meet with him.
What do you lose by going to listen? Just go listen to what he has to say. And he goes and nobody knows the conversation, but as they say, the rest is history. Zuhair comes back a changed man. His face is radiant. He's like, pack our bags. And he's telling his wife, you can go back home now and you can take all the possessions. I'm going with Hussein. And, he's just a changed man in one meeting. Now, what is the difference between Hur and Zuhair and the thousands of others who did not change? I believe the reason why they were saved and not others is because they had preserved their inner purity. Even though they may have been ignorant of who Hussein was at the time, but they had left some inner purity within themselves, and that is what saved them when they needed it most. I give an example of this. On the day of Ashura, when Imam Hussain had to go and fight the enemy for the final time, before he confronted the enemy, he addressed them. He started talking to them. Think about what you're doing. Do you not know who I am? I am the grandson of your prophet. I am the son of the daughter of your prophet. Have I broken any law in Islam for which I deserve to be killed? And he urges them, and they're not willing to listen. So what they start doing is they say, beat the drums to drown the voice of Al-Hussein so that people cannot listen to his message. And so they start making a racket and noise and all that. When Imam Hussain realizes they're not going to listen to him, what does he say to them? He says, yes, indeed, you will not listen to me. Why? فَقَدْ مُلِئَتْ بُطُونَكُمْ مِنَ الْحَرَامِ فَطُبِعَ عَلَى قُلُوبِكُمْ. Because your stomachs have been filled with unlawful food so much that your hearts are now sealed from any guidance. Now keep in mind, these were, at least apparently, they were Muslims. So when the Imam is saying your stomachs are filled with haram, with unlawful food, he's not talking about them eating pork or drinking alcohol or slaughtering animals unlawful, like eating them without doing the dhabiha. No, they're following the Islamic law. They're praying, they're eating halal meat. What is the Imam talking about? He's talking about food that was acquired with unlawful wealth, money that was purchased, earned unlawfully and then used to buy. So there are many different ways in which we harm our soul, our spiritual side, our heart, so that we don't heed to guidance anymore. But the point to remember here is that when a person has lost his inner purity, then even the Quran, even the Messenger of God, and even an Imam cannot guide him. This is very important. An Imam can guide us. We all want guidance. The Quran can guide us. But the first step, my dear brothers and sisters, has to come from us. And that first step is we have to have preserved our inner purity. If we lose this inner purity, there is nothing left. The means is not there. Even when guidance falls on it, it reacts differently. That's why the Quran itself, when it speaks about itself, it gives parables, and then it says, يَهْدِي بِهِ كَثِيرٌ وَيُضِلُّ بِهِ كَثِيرٌ. That when the Quran gives parables, it says many are guided by it, and many are misguided by it. See, the example I like to give is, when sun shines on a piece of wood, it hardens it. When the same sun shines on butter, it melts it. Right? When rain falls on a rose, it gives out fragrance. But when rain falls on a sewage, it gives out a stench. Now, if you think of the sun as guidance, or if you think of rain as God's mercy, the analogy we're giving here is that it is not up to the sun to determine whether something will harden or soften when it shines upon it. It is the property of the recipient that will determine it. And it is not up to God's mercy that will determine whether somebody who receives it, his heart softens or hardens, whether he receives the guidance or he turns against it. It is the heart that will determine it. Is it rusty or is it a rose? Is it soft? Is it does it have the property to want to soften when it receives sunlight or rain? Or does it have a property to harden? Does it have a property to give out fragrance or give out a stench? So it is really our decision initially that we keep this sense of purity. Lesson number 3. I don't know how we're doing for time. I'll try and speed up. Lesson number 3. Learn to accept that even though suffering in life is not to be sought after or prayed for, but it is not to be feared or fled from either. Suffering gives meaning to life. Nothing keeps our false barriers and the veils of me the most, like being in a state of constant ease and comfort. It is only when we are shaken that we are forced to throw out the mask. Sometimes we need to be pushed to get fed up and say, I'm tired of pretending to be who I'm not or who I don't want to be. To stand up for what matters, we need sometimes a little bit of suffering in life. It is easy to pretend a false me when there is apparent happiness and it is perpetual. Now, I don't need to elaborate on how we can draw this lesson from Ashura, because the tragedy of Karbala is unparalleled in the suffering it caused Imam Hussain and his family and his companions. But let me explain you a philosophy of life that I hope you will always remember. This is perhaps one of the most important things you can take away this evening. Okay? This is a philosophy of life that I learned the hard way and that I had to come to realize after a lot of reading, thinking, research, and so on. And I'm offering this to you, as a gift, if you like, that I hope you will think about and cherish. What determines whether we get salvation or paradise or eternal bliss is not so much our acts of worship, but rather how we perform during our share of suffering and trials in life. How we are going to perform during the trials in life is what will determine whether we succeed or enter paradise or not. However, the inspiration, the will, the determination to stand up to these trials and to overcome them successfully depends on our level of obedience to God. And that is why we said in lesson number 2, the purity of heart must be preserved. I think you were with me. What I'm saying is, you will only enter paradise based on how you perform in the trials that life is going to throw each and every one of us in this room. Not one of us is going to escape that. But the energy and the will to stand up to these challenges and to succeed will come from the level of obedience we have before the trials. To the degree that we are obedient to God, that we are God-wary or God-conscious, what we call taqwa in Arabic, to the degree we are muttaqeen or muttaqoon, that degree will determine whether we will fail or succeed in our trials. Now, I want to prove this to you from the Quran, both the fact that the yardstick and measure of success is going to depend on how we do in our tests in life, and also the fact that the will to succeed and the opportunity to do so will come from obedience before that. In the interest of time, I will not read the Arabic here, but in chapter 2 of the Quran, verse 214, what God says is, "Do you suppose that you shall enter paradise, though there has not come to you the like of that which befell those who went before you?" Do you think you'll enter paradise when we haven't given you what befell those before you? Stress and distress befell them, and they were convulsed until the messenger of God and the faithful who are with him began to ask, "When will the help of God come?" Look, Allah's help is indeed near. What is Allah saying? You're not going to be spared. We tested those before you to such an extent that even the messenger of God who was with them began asking, "When is God going to help us?" Indeed, my help is always near. This is what Allah is saying. In chapter 29, verse 2 and 3, Allah says, do people suppose that they will be let off because they say we have faith, and that they will not be tested? Certainly we tested those who were before them. So Allah will surely ascertain those who are truthful, and He shall surely ascertain the liars. What He's saying is, when I am going to determine who amongst you are truthful and who amongst you are liars, I am not going to base it on the fact that you say, Amanna, we have faith. I'm going to test you. You're going to have to prove it in action, not in words. Okay? So this proves without a doubt that no one is going to be spared, but it also proves no one's going to paradise until they've been tested. Now, I talked about the Battle of Uhud earlier. When Allah does a post-mortem of the Battle of Uhud in chapter 3 of the Quran, in the second half of Surah Al-Imran, at one verse, verse 155, He gives the exact reason why the Muslims fled from the battlefield, why they lacked the courage to stand and fight the enemy. We generally say it was because of their greed for the world. Listen to this, chapter 3, verse 155. He said, those of you who fled on the day when the two armies met, it was only Satan who made them stumble because of some of their past deeds. استزلهم الشيطان ببعض ما كسبوا. Generally, al-kasb is what you earn. But in the Quran, al-kasb is you don't just earn wealth, but you also earn through your actions. Allah is very clear. He says, those of you who fled when the two armies met, Shaitan was able to make them stumble because of some of their deeds, what they did in the past. Now, there's another verse that is fairly lengthy as well that proves this point, and I was going to again read it, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to tell you the gist of it, and you can go back and read it. And this is again chapter 2 of the Quran, verse 249. And God is describing the time when the children of Israel ask God to help them fight Goliath and his people. And God appoints for them Talut, who in the Bible is Saul. And so this prophet, Saul and his army of the faithful, they are now marching to go and fight, Goliath and his army, and with them is David, who later becomes King David, Nabi Dawood, peace be on him. And the verse says that as they set out, Saul says to them that God is going to test you with a stream. We're going to come to a river at which point you're all going to be extremely thirsty. At that point, God is going to test you. You are not permitted to drink any water from that stream except for one gulp. You can only take one handful and drink. And when you're thirsty, if you can only drink one gulp, that can be sometimes worse than not drinking at all, right? Because once you taste that one, now you have to stop yourself. It's easier to just jump across the stream and move on. But no, drink one, but then don't drink anymore. Now, the Quran here says all of them drank except for a few. In other words, they drank to their fill. And then it says very clearly, it links this event where they failed in this test, where they were told not to drink and they disobeyed and they drank. It says very, very clearly that because they did so, when they came and they saw this giant, when they saw Goliath and they saw the army, they began saying, we have no strength today against Goliath and his troops. They lost courage. The few who obeyed, who did not drink more than a gulp, they were the ones who were certain. God describes them as those who were certain that they will one day meet their Lord. They said, how often has a small party overcome a large party by Allah's will, and Allah is with the patient ones. Another clear example that God gives you little tests in life first, little tests like fast in Ramadan, get up early morning and say your prayers, don't do haram, do this, do that, little tests. These little tests is building the will, the energy, the willpower that is going to then protect you from the major test and calamity that will come later in life, when God forbid your child passes away, or God forbid your doctor tells you you've got cancer and you're going to die in 3 months, or God forbid, you know, you lose all your wealth or whatever, right? There's going to be a major test for each one of you and each one of us in this room. And how we perform in that test will determine whether we get to paradise, whether we get salvation or not. But the fuel will come from the little tests, the acts of obedience that come before. So when we turn to Ashura and Karbala, and we look at examples, like take the example of Sa'id bin Abdullah, right? The man who, when Imam Hussain had to say his noon prayer, he stood before him and arrows were being showered at the Imam, and he took the arrows on his chest. And this is an example I've given many times, you know, from the pulpit as well, that it is not natural. If I throw a crumpled paper at you right now, you will duck. This is an arrow, an iron or wooden arrow coming at you, and you're just standing there and taking it on your chest. It defies logic. It's not natural, right? So when we wonder and say, you know, how did he do this? How was he able to take suffering to this degree? It is because of something he did before that. He didn't just come to Karbala and suddenly become enlightened overnight. Okay? On the night of Ashura, yes, 5 minutes? Okay. On the night of Ashura, we see Imam Hussain pleading with his companions to leave him and to go away and spare their lives. He extinguishes the lights and tells them, go away, save your lives. Hold the hand of somebody with you, your family, take them with you. But not one of them leaves. And in the Battle of Uhud, it's broad daylight and the Muslims are running up the mountain. Right? What is the difference? The answer is what the Quran is suggesting. It is directly tied to what we have done in the past. Our past deeds determine how we perform during trials later on. Now, because I have only a few minutes left, I'm going to skip lesson 4, lesson 5, lesson 6, and lesson 7. And I understand the TMA campus here has a website, so if you like, I will give you a transcript or a document with the entire lecture, and you can post it, inshallah. You can go through it if you like. I will come to a conclusion and mention 2 or 3 points only that sort of summarizes the other lessons that I haven't mentioned and what I was going to put in conclusion. There are 2 or 3 things that I would like us to keep in mind that we can introduce into our lives and inshallah help us follow the path of Imam Hussain. Number 1, know and realize with full conviction that life is short. It is very short. And it is foolish to sacrifice your soul and your eternal happiness because of worrying about what people will say and how they will judge you. If you obey Allah, it is foolish to worry about what people will say and how they will judge you only because you're obeying Allah and doing what is right. We can either fear Allah or we can fear everyone else. The latter can neither harm us nor benefit us. They are at best ordinary creatures like ourselves, and they will also die one day. And in the grand scheme of things, their opinion has no value. So when you're caught in this situation where you're embarrassed because of what people will say versus what Allah will say, think of what Allah will say, because your eternal salvation and happiness is tied to that. But what people will say is just something in your mind. It might not even be what they're thinking or saying. Number 2, when we decide to make a change in our lives, whether it be something apparently insignificant, like not listening to music that is haram, or putting on hijab, or saying our daily prayers on time, or even a greater goal in Islam, let us look for a friend that we can journey with. It is said that when you're lost alone, you're truly lost. But when you're lost with a friend, you're having an adventure. So, have a friend in your life who can support you, who can encourage you, who can inspire you, and who can motivate you towards the hereafter. Because that friend is a blessing from Allah. And on the Day of Judgment, one of the major complaints that the inmates of hell will have is, I wish I had not taken so-and-so for a friend. Okay, this is in the Quran, chapter 25, verse 28. Ya waylata laytani lam attakhidh fulanan khalila. I wish I had not taken so-and-so for a friend in life. Sometimes a friend can ruin your hereafter. And lastly, let us make it our goal to follow the caravan of Imam Hussain, peace be on him. It is the most perfect way to overcome our personal limitations, to liberate ourselves from the egoic me and the obsessions with the egoic self. It is the surest way to ensure that we are also part of Imam al-Hujjah al-Mahdi, may Allah hasten his appearance. So never stop asking yourself this question, that had I lived in the year 61 AH, would I qualify for Karbala? If we keep this question in mind all the time, we will constantly look for ways to assess ourselves. I end with this, and I pray to the Almighty subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the inspiration or tawfiq to find the right guides in our lives, and to follow their footsteps and to fulfill the purpose for which He created us. May He bless us all with ziyarah and pilgrimage in this world to these noble guides, and may He bless us with their intercession and company in the hereafter, and may we attain to living in the neighborhood of Imam Hussain, blessings and peace be on him, in paradise. Ameen Ya Rabbal Alameen. And I thank you very much for your time and listening to me patiently. Thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I've just received some very, very interesting questions, and this is definitely proof that you haven't been dozing off or losing attention. The questions are actually numerous, and unfortunately the nature of the subject is such that every question, when we get into it, requires 5-10 minutes. So I'll have to really be very brief if I'm going to answer more than one. So the first question I got here was, it says, you mentioned that we all receive a test in life that is major. What about the individuals who are constantly being tested? And those who are constantly struggling, is this a punishment? Are they being rewarded more? Okay. So the brief answer to this is a test and a punishment at a physical level looks the same, smells the same, tastes the same. Okay, it could, one could lose wealth, one could lose health, one could have some unfortunate incident in life. It could be because of a past sin, or it could be a trial. Even the punishment in this world is a form of blessing, because it is meant to jolt the person and wake him up. It is not meant to punish for the sake of punishment, unless it is someone who is truly evil and he's punished in this world and then punished again in the hereafter. The way you tell the difference is in your reaction to that event in your life. If it brings you closer to Allah, then know it is a test. If it takes you away from Him, then it is a punishment. Okay. So if you find you experience something in life, and then after that you turn to Allah, you repent, you ask Him for help, you find yourself reciting du'as, you find yourself waking up in the middle of the night, you find yourself drawing closer to Allah, like the people who said, فَزَادَهُمْ إِيمَانًا, their faith increases. Like, for example, when our father or mother passes away, right? God forbid, and then what does what happens to you then? Does it bring you closer, or does it make you, why did Allah do this to me? Did I really deserve this? And have doubts in God, and so on and so forth. So our response will determine whether it is a trial or whether it is a punishment. As far as people who are constantly being tested, if it is a trial and a test, it is a sign of greater faith. Allah tries us and then elevates us, and then tries us and then elevates us. The degree of test depends on what He thinks of us. If He doesn't try us at all, it's because He doesn't think our faith has the capacity to withstand the test at all. So, just a couple of days back, actually, I was speaking to a group, and I mentioned to them that we have in hadith that the faith of a person and his trials in life are like the two sides of a scale. As his faith increases, as a mu'min's iman increases, his bala increases. Okay? So I'll leave it at that. Second question was, what was it about Zuhair ibn al-Qayn that made Imam Hussain really want him in his army? I don't know about Zuhair's personal history, or I haven't had the chance to look at it so much to see, his background. But I think Imam Hussain handpicked his companions, and he said this on the day of Ashura: the kind of companions I got. Not even my grandfather got them, not even my father, not even my brother Hassan got them. And another thing I've mentioned as well recently was that a lot of times when we think of the companions of Imam Hussain, we think of them in terms of they came to Karbala to help Imam Hussain. Sometimes it is useful to think of it the other way. Imam Hussain brought them to Karbala to help them complete and perfect their souls. In other words, these were individuals that Imam Hussain saw that these individuals have now maxed out what they could do on their own, but they're ready for enlightenment. They're ready to become something greater than human and life itself. So he handpicked them and brought them and then led them to perfection. And that's what we want to do. We want to get to a point, we have many hadith that when the Imam al-Mahdi, may Allah hasten his appearance, returns, he will bring enlightenment to people. You read some hadith where he says he's going to place his hand on the head of people and they're going to get enlightened, right? But we see also that not all his companions are of the same degree. So we want to go as far as we can, keep our hearts as pure as we can, so that the last bit of enlightenment that we can't do on our own, inshallah, that is where a divinely appointed guide helps us to get there. Okay. There is a question here: what if someone worries more about the dunya than the akhirah? How does one eliminate the love of the dunya out of their heart if they are spiritually deprived? This is unfortunately a very lengthy discussion, but the brief answer to this is that the love of dunya competes with the love of God, and to be obsessed with the world is because of being distant from God, and we need to find ways to change that. What our soul is actually looking for is the love of Allah. That is what is actually wired in us and what we are seeking in our true innate nature or fitrah. But that love is misplaced. See, and that is why, for example, you see Imam Ali, peace be upon him, in Nahj al-Balagha, when he describes himself versus the opposite, he says, "Ana ya'asubul mu'mineen," I am the leader of the faithful. وَالْمَالُ يَعْصُبُ الْمُنَافِقِينَ, and wealth or possessions or the world is the leader of the hypocrites. He doesn't say Muawiyah is the leader. He draws from something that is not apparently tangible. Materialism. He's saying, I am the leader of the faithful, materialism is the leader. So these are all hints that we can take, that if we can somehow align ourselves more in following Imam Ali, in finding the love of God, and there are lots of lectures out there on trying to find that, then inshallah we can overcome this. Does Islam believe in the greater good, justifying the means for an end? No. The short answer is no. The end does not justify the means in Islam, and unless the questioner has another meaning to it, I don't know. There's a question over here. It says, I feel like my faith is like a graph, like up and down. Some days I feel a peak, and other days I go on a tangent of sin. What advice would you suggest? I would suggest two things. One is, look into the issue of taqwa, because Allah says in the Quran, إن الذين اتقوا إذا مسهم طائف من الشيطان تذكروا فإذا هم مبصرون. Those who are God conscious all the time, the Satans do tawaf around their heart. They circumambulate, they go around their hearts. They're trying to find a way to get in. طائف من الشيطان. So as soon as they try and get in, they immediately remember. They wake up, they realize, oh my God, this is exactly what's happening. And then they come back. So the reason why we sometimes, are faithful and then we just fall back is we sort of become unconscious of God. We go into this slumber, and that allows shaitan to get into our heart and attack us. And by the time we realize and recover from it, it's too late. It's not doom and over, but if we catch that, then we need to sort of, work on that. So the other advice is that never lose hope in Allah. Shaitan is not after us to commit sins. He doesn't care, because Allah has told him that you can make my servants sin as much as you want. I'm opening the doors of repentance. Every time they repent sincerely, I'm going to forgive them. Now he knows there's no point in making people sin, the children of Adam, because they can repent. What he's really after is to get us to a point where we are averse to repenting, where we give up, where we lose so much hope, we think, you know what, there's no point in me asking for forgiveness anymore. Now it's just, I'm a gone case, it's over for me. That's when he truly wins. And that is why it is said, the greatest sin is losing hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Losing hope in His mercy. So never lose hope. Every time you fall, stand up again. Just like Imam Hussain did in Karbala. It's not a good comparison because we're talking about sin here, and sin doesn't touch him. But every time his enemy attacked him, every time he fell, he stood again. Every time he fell, he stood again. He didn't allow the enemy the satisfaction that he's not going to stand up again. The same for us. We commit a sin, Allah assures us, come to me sincerely. Okay, as long as we have sincerity, all is not lost. That our greatest possession is our sincerity. Don't lose that, and inshallah, may Allah help all of us. And of course, we should constantly pray for each other. I need your prayers, and we should all pray for each other that we have taqwa. If you have very old friends who are very good people, but are still very much attached to worldly pleasures, and you can feel that sometimes they are distracting your spiritual journey, how do you deal with them without hurting them by distancing yourself? Remember that they are good people. And I was told there's another question that's very similar here. It says, in a condition that we are surrounded with friends with a so-called cooler approach on life and a bit lenient in religiosity, and when we cannot change those friends due to circumstances, should we blend in flexibly or be patient? Okay, so it's similar in that how do we deal with friends. It reminds me of this saying that I've mentioned as well. This little child who prays to God and says, "Oh God, please make religious people good and make good people religious." This seems to be a problem with a lot of people's experiences. That I know people who are very religious, prayers, fasting, tasbih, zikr, Quran, but they're mean at heart. They're not good people. And I know people who are so nice, so kind, so helpful, so generous, but they're not religious. On one hand, we don't want to give up on our friends, not because we, can't live without the friend, but because we have a duty towards helping them as well. We can't say, I'm going to paradise, the rest can go to hell. Because that itself is detrimental to our spiritual progress itself. But on the other hand, we need to remember, as I mentioned, there's a verse in Quran where people will say on the Day of Judgment, I wish I had not taken so and so for a friend. So Allah has not appointed us as infallible imams to be guides over people. We have a duty to do amr bil ma'ruf, nahy anil munkar and so on. But your first duty is to yourself. Now, depending on each individual circumstance, you will have to decide for yourself. But if there is a danger of you, losing faith, getting into haram, it doesn't matter how good the friend is or how old they are, you need to distance yourself because you need to protect yourself. If that friend had a physical illness that was infectious that you could get, I think they would understand if you had to keep a distance from them. But this is of course something spiritual that they might not understand. But once you are able to insulate your own faith, then we need to try to be influencers as opposed to just assuming that our friends always influence us. Just like our friends influence us, we can influence them as well. And a lot of times the way to send a message to our friends that we have made different choices in life is not to tell them verbally, but to show them. It's just like with children. What you show them, they listen, they follow, they admire, they emulate. What you tell them, they don't, right? If they see that you are now taking more time in saying your prayers, if they see that when it's time for prayer, you rush for prayers, if they see you now attending the mosque more regularly, if they see that you are now participating in humanitarian activities, religious activities, they'll either accompany with you or they themselves will withdraw. Right? A lot of times you don't have to spell it out or say it or be hurtful. Okay, I think we're probably out of time, right? 2-3 minutes maybe. Some of these questions, unfortunately, I cannot answer them. I will read out the questions, but I can't answer them because of the time they will take. How does one deal with a system that is not based on the Sharia of Allah? For example, debt, financial obligations, relationships. And I'm guessing this is talking about the society we live in, where we sometimes have to deal with the system and choose between Islam and that. It's a very good question, but unfortunately, I will need time for that, and perhaps on another occasion. There's also another question here that is very good, but it's very general. It says, can you please elaborate on preserving one's inner purity? What are some tips for us to do so? Okay, so again, it's a broad question, and it talks about, it goes into the whole issue of tazkiyatun nafs and muhasabatun nafs and so on. It's something we need more time for. What are the roles of the mind and the soul when it comes to diminishing the ego? Do we or can we control both the soul and the mind, or just one, and how do they affect each other? Now here I'm going to be a little egoic and refer you to some of my past lectures, because I have discussed this whole idea about the mind and the ego in a series of lectures. I can't remember now, what that series is called. Was it the negative suffering, or one of those? But I know that I have talked about the ego and the mind and the soul at length. If you don't mind, it might take a few hours to go through all the lectures, but it is a lengthy subject. Yes, we can control the soul and the mind, but we need to understand what we mean by mind versus the mind-made false self, and who is controlling, who is the real me. It's a vast subject. I have two more here, and then I have a request that, okay, you mentioned your success in suffering depends on your past ways, attitudes, experiences. What results should one expect from suffering when having sinned in the past, as all humans do, not being ma'soom, but one regrets and repents for past and tries to better one's future? The thing is, here I said we shouldn't lose hope. We should ask for forgiveness. But I also have to be honest and say, and we seek refuge with Allah from this, that if we commit a sin knowing it to be a sin, habitually, repeatedly, and knowing exactly what we're doing, not by mistake, not out of ignorance, it will take away our spirit and our faith. It will drain us of spirituality. We should not lose hope. We should repent. We should ask for forgiveness. We should try to reflect on why this happened, and maybe Allah wants us to learn something else from it. And we need to build again. But we shouldn't play with this and say, I can always repent, because we don't know when the major affliction or suffering will come to us. But this is an experience that you and I can also tell ourselves, that if we commit a sin knowingly, we feel less spiritual, isn't it? We feel like we're now not so interested in sitting on the prayer mat longer, or that closeness to Allah is sort of taken away from us. And when we attain higher levels of spirituality, actually, even when we do things that are makruh, that are disliked but not forbidden, we feel robbed of some spirituality. Like if we overeat, or if we do things that, we shouldn't be doing at our level. As the saying goes, Hasanatul Abrar, Sayyi'atul Muqarrabeen. The righteous deeds of the good deeds of the righteous ones are the sins of the elite who are most near to God. Right? So there are certain things that are not acceptable to certain people. For example, if someone is an alim, if he's a scholar, he's in Islam, he shouldn't be walking in the marketplace eating in public. Right? In the olden days, they used to have these open markets and bazaars, and people would sometimes just, buy a banana and they're walking down the alley and they're eating on the road and stuff like that. That is not becoming of an alim, for example. Right? So there are certain etiquettes and manners that if somebody of a higher rank does, it affects him in a different way. So we need to sort of constantly build our level of taqwa. There is also, just very quickly, there is also some hadith that says that when a true believer commits a sin, at the time that he is committing a sin, he is not a believer. What I'm saying really needs a discussion. For example, there is a hadith from Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, peace be on him, in which he says that if a mu'min commits zina, God forbid, fornication or adultery, at the time that he is committing that sin, his faith lifts up from his spirit and it hovers up above him. And when he is no longer sinning, his faith comes back into his heart. What the Imam is saying is that faith has a reality of its own, and it is so incompatible with sin. It's just like taking two magnets that are of similar poles. They just don't touch each other. The moment you bring sin into the body of a faithful, the faith just lifts off. It just can't stay there. It cannot withstand. Okay? So, if God forbid we were to die in a state of sin, then we have died without faith. Right? So it's a very interesting subject, but we need to think of our bodies and souls as fuel tanks. As we commit spiritual deeds and acts of worship, we are refueling. When we sin, we just drain ourselves of spirituality and faith. And if we are on a full tank, so to speak, then when afflictions hit us, we have the power and the energy to withstand and succeed. And the more we succeed, then the higher quality of gasoline we get into our bodies as well. We perform better. Okay, last question. Sometimes you intend to do good deeds with good intentions, but you feel Satan destroying and causing your intention to change. What do you advise? So this is where isti'adha comes in, where we turn to Allah for help. One of the reasons why people fail in life as well is at some point they begin thinking it's up to them and it's dependent on their ability and their spirituality and their power. We need to get to a point where we completely surrender to Allah and in humility realize that He is holding us. And if He was to let go of us, we are doomed. And that is why even though we say we are faithful and we are guided onto the right path, every day in our prayers we say, Ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim. Guide me to the right path. Keep me on the right path. If we have this absolute humility that it is God who is holding me and I am constantly in need of His help to remain faithful, then it becomes harder for Shaitan to approach us because now he's fighting God. He's not fighting me or my egoic self. Shaitan will continue trying to do what he does, but he's also very weak. Some ulama of akhlaq have mentioned a very interesting detailed analysis of how Shaitan attacks the faithful. The first thing he tries to do is he tries to make you commit a sin. If he can't make you commit a sin, what he tries to do is make you have sinful intentions in the good that you do. He makes you fantasize sin even though you don't commit sin. And then when you do good, he tries to interfere in the intention so that now you do it for other than Allah. And then if he can't do that as well, if you have reached a level where you can do things sincerely for Allah, then what he does is he tries to distract you from doing a better good deed with a lesser good deed, so that if he can't get you to sin, he can at least get you to do less good. And that is where it becomes challenging, because you have two good deeds and you don't know which one is better. And he's going to try and veer you towards that which is of lesser importance or lesser good to your hereafter. So that's again a lengthy discussion, but an interesting one that inshallah you can think about. The final question, which again unfortunately I apologize I cannot fulfill, is it says, Assalamu alaikum wa alaikum salam. Can I humbly request that you briefly go through the remaining lessons you have prepared? This would be most valuable. Okay, we would be here all night. Actually, I promised Brother Abbas that what I will do is I will mention the lesson title, but I won't discuss it. Okay? So let me just, we stopped at lesson 3, was it? So lesson 4 was going to be about how Imam Hussain is a magnet of love and kindness and compassion, and that we need to allow ourselves to be pulled into him and to drown ourselves in his love. And I was going to talk about, looking at Hussain not from an analytical, historic, philosophical perspective or faith only, but an emotional perspective, and just drowning ourselves in him, in his personality, and how that can help break the barrier of me. Lesson 5 was about not compromising on our faith, and we have talked about that in different ways. Lesson 6 was about the importance of developing, brotherhood or sisterhood in our spiritual quest. I see, Brother Muhammad Habash is here, a dear and near brother to me, and we have time and again talked about this idea of fostering ukhuwa and futuwa and in this sense of brotherhood. And here I was going to talk about how in the Western society we live a virtual world where we communicate through gadgets, but we need to develop a sense of, I don't know if fraternity is the right word, but where we have face-to-face relationship, and we help each other as well in breaking the barrier of me and attaining spirituality. And I was going to give examples from Karbala as well. Lesson 7 was to learn about our faith, and wanting to become spiritual and having love for Imam Hussain is good, but it doesn't replace knowledge. And I was going to give examples of how if we don't have knowledge of our faith and we don't understand and we can't defend our faith, sometimes even with the best of intentions we can do more harm than good, and we can actually do a disservice to our spiritual quest as well. So very predictable, very obvious ones, and I'm sure you can think of many other lessons as well. But as I said, inshallah, if there is an interest, I can email this lecture to Brother Abbas, and I don't know if he shares it through a mailing list or a website or whatever. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. I will keep these questions, and inshallah, for those whose questions I didn't answer, I will inshallah use your questions as an inspiration for future lectures that I may give at other places. You might not be the audience, but inshallah you will get the thawab for that, inshallah. Thank you very much.